Hello everyone and welcome back to our reading of Atlantis. Today we ask the question, was Atlantis in the Atlantic Ocean? Uh, hmm, I mean, with a name like that? Anyway, let's get started. Most Atlantis seekers agree with Edgar Cayce that Atlantis was located in the Atlantic Ocean. They have focused their search there, just west of Portugal. They claim that Atlantis was located there more than 12,000 years ago. These people seek evidence of an island culture that was hardly developed. Its citizens possessed advanced knowledge in science and technology. It was the seat of civilization. They believe that a great catastrophe, perhaps a comet, a meteor, or a nuclear or magnetic device, destroyed it, and the island disappeared into the waters of the Atlantic. Many believe, with Edgar Cayce, that colonists or survivors from Atlantis brought their superior knowledge not only to the Egyptians and other early Middle Eastern cultures, but also to the early peoples of the Americas, for example, the Mayans of Mexico. The Atlantic Ocean covers 33,420,000 square miles of the Earth's surface. Just where in this vast ocean was Atlantis? Atlantists claim that the high mountain peaks of Atlantis may have survived the disastrous flooding. The Azores, Canaries, and Madeiras are all islands off the coast of Africa. The Bahamas are off the North American coast. All of these islands have some claim to being Atlantis' highlands. The Azores. Atlantis seekers have focused most of their attention on the Azores. The Azores are 9 mountainous islands in the North Atlantic. They are more than 1,000 miles off the coast of Portugal, but almost directly opposite Plato's Pillars of Hercules. They are the peaks of the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, an underwater mountain range that runs north and south along the floor of the Atlantic. The rocks of the Azores are red, white, and black, as were the rocks of Atlantis described by Plato in the Critias dialogue. Plato also wrote that Atlantis had mountains in the north and a great plain in the south. Soundings of the ocean bottom in the vicinity of the Azores match this description. The high peaks of the Azores descend into the ocean, forming lower peaks under the water. Finally, there are both fresh water and hot water springs bubbling up from the ocean floor in the area of the Azores, just as in Plato's Atlantis. The Azores are in one of the Earth's most active volcanic and earthquake regions. Could that instability account for the catastrophic disappearance of Atlantis? The Canary Islands and the Madeiras. Just southeast of the Azores are the Canary Islands and the Madeira Islands. The Canaries are a group of volcanic islands in the Atlantic about 65 miles off the northwestern coast of Morocco. A few hundred miles north of the Canary Islands lies another mountainous group of islands known as the Madeiras. Both of these island groups are often considered to be part of the Atlantean Empire. They may have been part of mainland Atlantis that broke off during the Second Destruction. described by Case, or they may have been outlying islands. Underwater ruins have been seen off the Canaries and the Azores, but they have not been explored. Skeptics point out that the sea reclaims much coastal land in the course of time, and that the shoreline has been receding for a long time, so it is not surprising that there are underwater ruins off the coast of several continents and islands, including Venezuela, the Mexican Yucatan, and other parts of Central America, and the island of Bimini in the Caribbean. Bimini. On the western side of the Atlantic Ocean, off the coast of Florida, are the Bahama Islands. Some people believe that the Bahamas were a part of the Atlantis mainland, a colony of Atlantis, or an outlying island. Edgar Cayce predicted that in the late 1960s a portion of the Temple of Atlantis would rise out of the ocean off the coast of Bimini, part of the Bahamas. In 1969, divers discovered stone structures in the waters off the coast of North Bimini, but the controversy continues over whether the structures are natural or of human construction. In waters about 18 feet deep, explorers found huge jointed stones. Two sites were discovered, the Rhodes site and the East site. The Rhodes site resembles a huge reversed letter J. Its longer side is about 1900 feet in length, and is made of two parallel rows of large stone blocks. The shorter side is made up of two parallel rows, 327 feet long. The east site has an area of about 100 acres. A dike with several hundred yards of parallel rows of rectangular shapes borders the south edge. Explorer David Zink and his team speculated that this site was an ancient reservoir. The stones appear to have been underwater for a long time. The edges are rounded and the tops are domed like giant loaves of bread or pillars of stone. These stones are a natural construction, geologists argue. Beach rock erosion and cracking can form very regular blocks of rock, but Zink writes in The Stones of Atlantis that the joints between the stones and the Rhodes site are so narrow they resembled masonry. Zink's team turned up even more puzzling finds. There were three stones which together narrowed to an arrow pointing east. They seemed to point to two long, thin, cylindrical stones that looked very much like obelisks, although they were lying on their sides instead of standing upright. Obelisks are tall, four-sided pillars that come to a point at the top. This setup seemed to be a layout oriented to the equinox, writes Zink. The Zink team also found an ancient block with a tongue and groove pattern. It proved to be undateable. It is impossible to determine whether it came from a passing ship or was carried underwater from far away by the current, or is truly a relic from a lost civilization near Bimini. The geological testimony for Atlantis. Geologists say that millions of years ago there was only one continent which they call Pangaea. It was surrounded by water. Slowly, however, that continent broke up into two continents called Laurasia and Gondwanaland. These two continents slowly moved apart until there were the 7 continents we have today. Was Atlantis once the 8th? If you cut out the continents from a map and piece them together, you would see that the continents fit together fairly neatly, like a jigsaw puzzle. Writer and researcher Charles Berlitz says that all the pieces fit together with scarcely a missing piece, except in the southern section of the North Atlantic. That is the area outside Plato's Pillars of Hercules. Active and unstable area. The mid-Atlantic is considered to be a very active and unstable geological area. 3 major tectonic plates meet near the Azores. Tectonic plates are the underlying structural plates of the Earth's crust. The movement of the plates causes volcanic eruptions and earthquakes. It might also create new land masses and then cause them to be swallowed up. Berlitz, in Atlantis, the 8th continent, presents many accounts of islands that appeared and then disappeared in the Atlantic. Ship crews reported seeing uncharted islands that weeks later were no longer visible. Both ships and airplane crews have reported seeing underwater ruins. Author Francis Hitching points out in his book The Mysterious World, an Atlas of the Unexplained, that geology is a theoretical science. That is, it is based on logical conclusions drawn from an incomplete set of facts. There is no concrete proof that these conclusions are correct. Atlantis does not fit current theories concerning the formation and disappearance of land masses, but knowledge changes, and perhaps tomorrow the mystery of Atlantis will yield to a new theory. Geologists and Atlantis. Most geologists say that there could not have been a large landmass in the Atlantic within the past 12,000 years. If there ever was another continent or large island, it existed before humans inhabited the planet. The Azores could not be the remnants of an ancient island, they say, because the mid-Atlantic ridge is a new structure, not an old one that is sinking. Geologist Dorothy Vitaliano says that the mid-Atlantic ridge is one of the youngest large-scale features on the face of the Earth. It is being built up on the ocean floor of new material erupted from deep in the Earth's mantle along a vast rift along its center. If the mid-Atlantic ridge is in its building stage, then it would be impossible that a large landmass has sunk there. The ridge is still growing, not sinking, says Vitaliano. Furthermore, the material of the Earth's crust underneath the continents is different than that under the ocean floor, and there is no sign on the ocean floor of any crust that could have been a continent. Vitaliano also dismisses a favorite story told by Atlantis enthusiasts. In 1898, a crew was laying a transatlantic cable. The cable broke about 500 miles north of the Azores. Fortunately, the crew was able to bring up the cable. They also brought up chips of rock from a depth of more than 10,000 feet. A geologist identified the chips as tachelite, a black, glassy, volcanic rock created when molten lava cools. Tachelite supposedly forms above water, not beneath it, and it would supposedly disintegrate in seawater, especially after 15,000 years. Those convinced of the existence of Atlantis conclude, then, that the Azores must have been part of a larger landmass existing above water within the last 15,000 years. Vitaliano says, however, that tachylite has been known to form in water as deep as 17,000 feet. Cold sea water would harden the molten lava as effectively as would cool air. Vitaliano does not completely dismiss the notion that islands can rise and sink, but they do so gradually, she says. They do not disappear in a day and a night as Plato claimed. Skeptics also add that much of the Atlantic Ocean floor has been explored without finding any hint of a submerged island nation. But think how difficult it was to locate the sunken ship Titanic. It had been submerged for only a few decades, and searchers even had an idea of where to look. Yet finding the wreck was like finding a needle in a wet haystack. Descendants of Atlantis. Geologists say no to an Atlantis, but if there was no Atlantis, why do so many people who live along the North Atlantic have similar names for an island or continent that once supposedly existed there? The Basques live in northern Spain and western France, yet their language is distinct from the other peoples of those nations. In fact, they are sometimes called the descendants of Atlantis because their origins are undetermined. They call Atlantis Atlantica. The inhabitants of the Canary Islands also claim kinship with Atlantis. Their name for the missing island is Atalaya. Other ancient peoples also believed there was such an island in the Atlantic. The Vikings called it Atli. The Phoenicians called it Antilla. The ancient Egyptians wrote of a land called Amenti, and the Babylonians called their primordial paradise Aralu. The Aztecs of Mexico believed they came from an island to their east called Aztlan. Throughout Mexico, there are other place names that also sound much like the name Atlantis, Azatlan and Atlan, for example. The Hopi and some other Native American tribes have traditions that tell of their ancestors' homeland, an island in the Atlantic. The Mayans, Toltecs, and other Central American peoples have legends that trace their ancestry to an island in the east. Even in India, there is a reference to a place called Atala. So many diverse peoples have similar names for this missing land. Could this mean that there is some basis for the legend of Atlantis? Ancient maps. People who believe Atlantis really existed thousands of years ago look to an additional source of evidence to support their belief. Several ancient maps have been found that have accurate outlines of the Americas long before Christopher Columbus's famous voyage to the New World. The maps also show Antarctica before its discovery in the 1800s. The most famous is the Piri-Reis map. It not only shows Antarctica before it was covered with ice, but also a large island in the Atlantic. Piri-Reis was a Turkish admiral who lived in the 16th century. The map was discovered in Istanbul in 1929. In a note written on the map, Reis said he had used maps and charts from the time of Alexander the Great to draw this map. Those maps were probably copies of earlier maps from Egypt, which in turn were copies of still earlier maps from before the time when ice covered Antarctica. Those original maps were probably housed in the ancient library in Alexandria, along with almost 1 million other documents. The administrators of the library had collected copies of every document they knew about in the world. Most of the documents were lost to fire during the time of Julius Caesar and another later fire. Science historian Charles Hapgood and other scientists suggest that documents concerning Atlantis may have been among the lost collection. That is why there is no reference to Atlantis other than in Plato's writings. Hapgood has thoroughly studied the Piraeus map and other ancient maps. In his book, Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings, he comes very close to actually claiming that the huge Atlantic island on the Piraeus map could be Atlantis. He writes that on some reproductions of the map, there is a deep shade of color around the coastline of this island, and that this seems to suggest that highlands or mountains surrounded an interior plain. This would agree with Plato's description of Atlantis. Hapgood also points out that the harbors on the map are carefully detailed. He notes that the island is right over the underwater mid-Atlantic ridge, and that other ancient maps also testify to the existence of an island in this same location near the equator. Hapgood also refers to the findings of a Belgian scientist, Dr. René Malaise, who concluded that parts of the mid-Atlantic ridge were still above water at the end of the Ice Age. Malaise studied sediment from the top of the ridge. In the sediment, he found freshwater diatoms. They must have lived in a freshwater lake when the ridge was above water. The species of diatoms were all geologically recent, which meant that the freshwater lake existed in the past 10,000 to 15,000 years. According to most scientists, people who lived 10,000 or more years ago were in the Stone Age. It would be impossible for anyone to have mapped the world or even to have explored it. Who then drew the maps of this ancient world? How were they able to make such accurate maps of the world, including Antarctica? Some pro-Atlantists say that the Piraeus map does more than show that ancient people knew about Atlantis. They believe that the Atlanteans made the original map that was stored in the library at Alexandria. Charles Hapgood writes, "This island, if it really existed, would have been ideally suited by climate and location for agricultural and commercial development. An ideal home for a sea people. A secure base for a maritime empire whose ships would have had easy access to commercial ports in the Caribbean, South America, Europe, in Africa, even perhaps in Antarctica. Here, in this island, there might have developed the people who made these maps." Atlantis supporters also suggest that the Atlanteans, with their advanced technology, were able to survey the continents from the air or even from space. Hapgood believes that the Piraeus map and other ancient maps point to an advanced world existing before the civilizations we know about. As to why there is no evidence of this, Hapgood says the more advanced the culture, the more easily it will be destroyed, and the less evidence will remain. If highly advanced civilizations did exist, why do only stone implements and structures remain? Stone does not disintegrate as quickly as do metals and other materials. It is unlikely that metal tools from 12,000 or more years ago would remain to this day. Will our civilization appear to have been a Stone Age 10,000 years from now? When did Atlantis exist? Most archaeologists say that a civilization like the one Plato describes could not have existed before 4000 to 3000 BC, and a civilization such as the one that Case describes could not have existed until today. According to the most accepted chronology of prehistory, in 10,000 to 9,000 BC, human civilization was still in the Stone Age. People had not yet learned to work with metals. They were still using primitive stone implements. In 9,000 BC, 600 years after Plato's date for the destruction of Atlantis, people were just beginning to learn how to farm and to domesticate animals. It wasn't until 6000 BC that there were small, permanent farming communities, and it wasn't until 3500 BC that these began to reach the size of small cities. At about that time, people also started making bronze tools and weapons. The wheel was finally invented about 3000 BC, which then led to the development of the cart, wagon, and chariot. How could a place like Plato's Atlantis have existed more than 12,000 years ago? Here was a well-developed society with laws, palaces, trade, metal tools, and weapons, war chariots, ships, art, religion, running water, fine clothing, and writing. The existence of Edgar Case's Atlantis would be even more far-fetched, with its flying machines, radar, medical technology, and super energy sources. There are several explanations for these differing accounts of prehistory. It is very possible that Atlantis didn't exist. Acceptance of that finding would leave our whole view of the world and its development intact. We would not have to revise any of our accepted theories. The dates given for Atlantis are too early. Atlantis did not exist until a long time after 9600 BC. Atlantis may really have been the islands of Crete and Santorini. They were partially destroyed 900 years, not 9,000 years before Solon's trip to Egypt. Atlantis existed as a highly advanced civilization in the midst of a very primitive prehistoric world. Atlantis was part of a very advanced world that was destroyed. Prehistoric scientists. Did an advanced civilization such as Atlantis exist 12,000 years ago? Are we simply relearning the skills and technology that other civilizations had invented? Science historian Charles Hapgood speculated that there were map makers before 10,000 BC. They had instruments for measuring latitude and longitude. He also says that these people were experts in measuring the Earth and other celestial bodies. Rock crystal magnifying lenses have been found in Asia Minor and Crete. The ancient Chinese worked with aluminum. They also recorded earthquakes with seismographs, instruments for measuring vibrations within the Earth. Their records are helping today's scientists predict major earthquakes. A wall painting in a temple in Egypt shows two priests carrying objects that look like light bulbs. The bulbs seem to be resting on insulators and are hooked up to a large braided cable. Objects that resemble today's batteries have been found in an area near the Caspian Sea. An ancient model of the solar system was recovered from the sea off the shores of Greece. It seems to be a kind of computer based on the stars. One scientist observed, "Finding this device is like finding a jet plane in the tomb of King Tut." Many archaeologists say that museums around the world own artifacts presently locked away that would shake up our current understanding of the prehistoric world, but, say those archaeologists, conventional science is reluctant to reconsider and revise that understanding, even in the light of new data, especially if those data don't fit accepted theories. But, as you soon will read, Atlanteans and other ancient peoples may have had very accurate skills in astronomy, mathematics, building, and measurement. Sure. Is it my imagination, or did this chapter get a bit sidetracked? Anyway, that's all for today. I'll see you next time. See ya!